If you're a parent, teacher, or school leader, and you're sick and tired of the frustration, anger, and unfair treatment of children at high risk in our public schools, then perhaps it's time for all of us to do something about it. In this podcast, Dr. Almitra Berry brings you tips, tools, strategies, and tactics to build successful solutions while touching, moving, and inspiring all of us to transform our schools so that every child thrives. Here's your host, Dr. Berry.
Welcome back, Equity Warriors. Thanks for tuning in. Now, before I introduce my guest today, I want to give y'all a bit of a heads up. Something big is coming, and I'll be dropping that announcement in a few weeks. So stay tuned and make sure you're subscribed to the show. Connect to me on social media so you don't miss the big reveal. Now, my guest today is Brian Whitley. He is VP of Communications at the Texas Public Charter Schools Association, advocating for policies that ensure every child has access to a high-quality publication. In his role there, Brian is proud to help parents, educators, students, and alumni tell their stories, as well as help lawmakers and the public understand how those stories fit into the bigger picture of education. Before joining TPCSA, Brian worked on the public affairs team at Success Academy Charter Schools in New York City. We'll make sure to tag Success Academy Charter Schools so that they know you're out here. He's also been a journalist at several papers, including the Dallas Morning News. So I have with me a real journalist today. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be with you today, Dr. Berry.
Well, I'm excited for this conversation. So full disclosure, starting this conversation, I do sit on the board of a small historically Black charter school in Houston, Texas. I am pro public schools, and that includes being pro schools of choice. That means charter schools. So I want to start our conversation today with talking about some of the myths, misconceptions, or lies that surround charters, starting with, let's just talk about what are public charter schools?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we find actually that a lot of people, even about 30 years into having public charter schools, still get a little confused or they might not understand that. But in a nutshell, charter schools are public, free, and open to all students. They are part of the public education system. And the charter part of charter school refers to the charter in the sense of the agreement with usually the state or the body that authorizes the charter school about what they are going to accomplish, how they're going to educate kids and what they're going to do.
So if I distill that down, charter schools have a contract with the state to perform the job of educating students. And if they don't do that, what happens to them?
Well, in Texas, they can be closed. There's a law that we refer to as the 3 strikes law, where if a public charter school gets an unacceptable accountability rating from the state for 3 years in a row, that's it. They have to close their doors. They can't appeal it. And that's kind of part of the deal, right? When we created public charter schools in Texas, and this applies in other states too, accountability was front and center. It was, charter schools were created, to meet the needs of families and students. And if they're not going to do that, then, they have to change.
Okay. So contrast that to a typical, in Texas, we call them ISDs, independent school districts. Some states have just, they say public schools or school district of, or unified school districts. In California, our second largest state. What happens, generally speaking, in regular ISDs in Texas if, let's say, over 3 years, they don't meet requirements for student achievement?
Yeah, well, there are kind of different levels to it. There's nothing so immediate as the law that applies to charter schools, the 3 strikes law.
So we're charter schools, 3 strikes and you're out. ISDs, 3 strikes and you're still in.
You're still in. Yeah. I mean,
It's not as I would venture a guess, or my understanding, and we can take Houston ISD. I live in Houston, so the nearest example is Houston ISD was deemed to be failing for multiple years. I know in a prior role that I had as a consultant, I worked with 28 failing schools in Houston ISD in 2013. Those schools are still there, right? Those schools are still open. Those schools are still serving children. So in spite of persistent achievement gaps and failing learners, the district was not closed. Now it has now been taken over by the state, and that's a whole other big, ugly picture. But charter schools don't get that sort of, let's just say, grace that an ISD would.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I mean, there have been efforts in the legislature here in Texas to change how that works a little bit. And if a school or a district is not, performing well enough for a period of time, then the state has some options, like the one they exercised in Houston ISD, but also some lighter touch measures that they can take. So it's changing. The way people think about that is changing, but it's still, at the end of the day, charter schools need to be not only responsive to the state, but they need to be responsive to parents. And that's sort of the ultimate in accountability.
What would you say are some of the, I know at BMI, the charter school where I sit on the board, I know what our challenges are. But what would you say are some of the broader challenges maybe for charter schools here in Texas?
Yeah, I think right now, the one that's at the top of mind for a lot of educators is just the facilities situation that they have. It's always been really hard for an upstart public charter school to figure out what building it's going to use, especially in its early days. That has gotten even worse in the last few years, just in the sense that construction costs have gone way up. The cost of lots of things have gone way up. And the other issue for us in Texas is that the way facilities funding works isn't exactly equal. Public charter schools don't receive local dollars, so essentially property tax dollars. And that's what most districts use to finance and maintain their facilities. And so charter schools get an allotment from the state for facilities, but it's from this shared pie, essentially, right? All charter schools share the pie, and the more students there are, the smaller you have to cut the pie. So right now it's something like $200 per student. And, for traditional districts, it can be $1,000 a student or a little more. So.
Yeah, we don't have to be phenomenal mathematicians to do some basic multiplication. $200 per student, even in a large elementary school with maybe 1,000 students, which is, large for an elementary. That's not enough money to build a building. And
that's true.
I know from we just realized it's been 6 years since I joined the board at BMI, and in all 6 years and long before I got there, they had been fundraising, and they have just now opened a new building after being a school, originally a private school here in Texas, they've been around for 57 years, but one of the first charter schools to open. They've been around all that time, but never able to have enough money to build a facility. It's taken years and years of fundraising to get that done. Whereas an ISD gets enough money to build buildings when they need it, or to issue bonds or get money from other means than your charter school. So that's one major challenge. Give me another one.
Well, I think this is not a public charter school specific challenge necessarily, but I think charter schools are still trying to make sure, as so many educators are trying to make sure, that their students are caught up from what happened during the pandemic, right? That,
Yeah.
That they have the foundations that they need in reading and in math. There's a lot, the state took a lot of steps in that direction at the Capitol, as far as, okay, we're going to have reading academies for teachers, and we're going to implement small group tutoring. And those are issues that are going to be stretching over a period of years, but it's something I think everybody is still grappling with.
Yeah, I see this everywhere, not just charter schools, public schools across the states that I work in. We know historically the data has always said that if a child receives, the research has always been on teachers. So if the child has a bad teacher 1 year, it takes 3 years of exceptional teaching for the child to catch up. So we won't call the pandemic a bad teacher, but it was a bad year of instruction. And we know that that is going to take 3 years of exceptional instruction to make up. And given the environment that we're in, very often getting exceptional instruction is difficult because of so many other factors, oversight, overloaded classrooms, a lack of teachers with currently an international teaching shortage, and the competition that charter schools face in attracting teachers when with lower funding, they can't always pay as much as the local school district does. Yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. And those sort of tie together, right? Because public charter schools have to look at their budgets, ties together to facilities, because charter schools have to look at their budgets and say, well, we have facilities upgrades that we have to make for whatever reason. Maybe they're required now for security reasons by law. But we want to pay our teachers more. And we have to balance those two things, and we have to balance them against other parts of the budget as well. So it is a challenge.
Yeah. One of the things that I've been, I don't want to say confronted with, but over the years confronted with as far back as 20 years ago that I can recall, is the issues of accountability for student learning. And this, I'll say it's a myth that charter schools cherry pick their students, right? You've heard that, I'm going to guess.
We have definitely heard that. Yeah, that's a very common one.
And it's not true.
I have some feelings about this one. It's not true, but it's not just that it's not true. It's sort of actually the opposite is true. And what I mean by that is there are so many public charter schools across the country, here in Texas, that opened specifically because they are trying to create opportunities for disadvantaged students. Okay. And that's what they do. I mean, the data here in Texas is really, really clear about it. In public charter schools, they enroll a disproportionate share of low-income students, students of color, English learners. We're actually working on a research project that looks at the degrees of poverty that students are in. So not just who's a little bit economically disadvantaged, but who's a lot economically disadvantaged. And those students too attend charter schools at a higher percentage, right, than public schools in the rest of the state. And that has always been so close to the heart of so many educators who start public charter schools. I mean, that's what they set out to do. They wake up and go to bed thinking about it. And so, it's frustrating when people say charter schools just want the good kids, quote unquote, right? They somehow figure out which kids are going to ace the test, and they just take those. I mean,
only take the good ones. Yeah.
Right. I don't even know how they would do that, honestly. So yeah, it's a bit frustrating. Well,
charter schools are open enrollment, right? So anybody who wants to go signs up to go, fills a space. There's no lottery, isn't it? First come, first serve till something's full, and then you get on a waiting list.
Yeah. So you fill out, if you want to enroll your child in a charter school, you fill out a form with basic identifying information. Doesn't take very long. It's just a few minutes. And then the school fills the seats based on, those forms. If there are too many students who are looking for a seat in a certain grade level at a certain school, typically there is a random lottery. In most cases, that's what happens.
Okay. So lottery still exists. All right. You said something about, we'll call it free and reduced lunch. Students eligible for free and reduced lunch, disproportionately represented in charter schools. But something that I hadn't heard anybody talk about before, which I find fascinating, is looking at just how free and reduced lunch you are, so to speak. Not in just numbers, this school has 98% of their kids free and reduced lunch. And actually, I think that's our school's numbers, 98% free and reduced lunch. But that some of those kids may just barely meet the criteria for free and reduced lunch. And other children could be unhoused, could be in foster care. I mean, there are just so many other factors that would impact the degree of financial impoverishment of a child. And we know that from the data, the more impoverished a child is, the more it impacts their learning and their engagement in school. So you all are studying that. Hey there, Equity Warriors. I want to take a quick moment to share something exciting with you. You know how passionate I am about equity in education, right? Well, I've created a special space, a safe space, where we can dive even deeper into these crucial topics. It's our Patreon channel, and I'd love for you to join me there. Here's why it's so awesome. As a Patreon subscriber, you'll get access to exclusive content that I will not share anywhere else. I'm talking additional insights, workshops like you would get in regular professional learning sessions, resources that can really amplify your impact in education. But it's more than just extra content. By subscribing, you are directly supporting our mission. You're helping to create more valuable discussions and resources that you've come to love. You're part of the change we're making in educational systems. And let me tell you, our Patreon community, it is something special. It's a place where passionate educators and advocates can come together, share ideas, and drive real change. So if you're ready to take your commitment to educational equity to the next level, I'd be thrilled to have you join me. Just head over to patreon.com/3E podcast. That's patreon.com/3E podcast. Remember, your support means the world to me, and it helps me continue this important work. Together, we can create the educational system all our students deserve. Thanks for considering, and now let's get back to the episode.
Yeah, it's really interesting. In 2019, actually, so not that long ago, Texas passed this really big and transformative piece of legislation called House Bill 3. And it's a school finance bill. And one of the measures that it takes is that it provides weighted additional funding for economically disadvantaged students. But it does it in a particular way, sort of a sophisticated way, where the state takes every neighborhood. It's actually a smaller unit than that. It's a census block group.
Okay.
But essentially a neighborhood. It takes every neighborhood, assigns that neighborhood a score based on median income, but also some other factors, like how many people own a home, how many children in those neighborhoods live in single-parent households, the overall educational attainment of the adults in that neighborhood. And then based on that score, the state classifies every neighborhood as something between tier 1 and tier 5. And so if you're a public school in Texas, the neighborhood where your student lives, if that's an economically disadvantaged child, that actually influences the amount of additional dollars that you receive. And from our point of view, that's not only great, but it allows us to look back at, okay, what are actually the academic outcomes for students in those different tiers, those different neighborhoods.
Yeah, cool. California does something similar, and I know you're not the California person, but for listeners who are, the money follows the child. So the child has the multiple categories that they are free and reduced lunch, foster, second language learner, multilingual learner, and a few other criteria. And there's an allocation, but it's on the child, not the neighborhood with like a tier to the neighborhood, but that pot of money. So if a child is multilingual learner who's in a foster home and Title I, they've got those 3 extra pots for that child. And as the child moves around a district, those pots of money follow the child. So a little more surgical, maybe. But it's good to know that Texas is making some effort, and that it's actually being studied as to how that impacts student learning. I think that's cool. What do you think makes the biggest difference when it comes to charter schools? And I do want to talk about TPCSA they've done some work on closing achievement gaps and expanding opportunities. I'm looking at the flyer and that information there. And I do want to dig into that because I think it's important. I believe you also have something coming on special education students in charter schools. Yeah. Okay. You're nodding. So I know this. Do you know this before we dive into it? But there are a lot of things that it's not cherry picking. Clearly, charter schools aren't cherry picking their children. But what is it about charter schools where we're seeing students who may have performed poorly in their ISD who come to a charter school and show gains? What is it about that charter school environment that elevates achievement?
There are so many different reasons, not to give you a cop-out answer, but I think part of what makes charter schools special is just the diversity of the missions and the models and the way that educators try to tackle this huge job. Definitely there are recurring themes, right? There are things we see a lot. I think one of them is a culture of high expectations. And maybe the flip side of that coin is a culture of making sure kids just have all of the opportunities. I mean, one of the things that we see when we look at the data across a bunch of different topics and different kinds of students is that at charter schools there are more kids who take these advanced courses, whether that's AP, advanced placement, or international baccalaureate, or a dual credit course, which is usually actually at the campus of a college or a university. And those classes for a long time, and you probably have seen this or have experience with this, but those classes for a long time were sort of the province of certain schools, right? And certain students. And there was just an assumption almost that a lot of students couldn't hack it, right? Or they couldn't handle it.
Right.
And I think, that's not to, we don't want to over generalize, but a lot of public charter schools have really tried to be very intentional about making sure that every student believes that he or she can do that and open those doors. So I think that's a big deal. And I think that matters a lot. But there are tons of other factors. I mean, I think one thing that charter schools have done well historically, in a lot of cases, is create these environments where teachers and families work really closely together. And I know that sounds really simple, but
it's not
it makes
simple.
a huge difference.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It makes a huge difference. I mean, we heard from one student who said, and I thought this was really kind of put a nice bow on it, who said that he felt like a number at the school that he used to go to before he went to a charter school. And that, that sometimes if a school is really big, that's hard to avoid.
Yeah.
But, I think public charter schools really have that in mind. And then, too, there are so many different kinds of charter schools. And I think, parents and families don't think about choosing a public school today in the same way that they did 10 years ago or 20 years ago or however far back you want to go. Like, now they are looking for, okay, but it's not just, is this a good school, but it's also, is this the right school for
my child?
Kid? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, we used to just go to whatever I'm an old head, whatever the neighborhood school was, that's where you went, right? There, I remember as a child, I went to school down the street, or I went to the school where my mother was a teacher. That was the neighborhood school. That's where you went. There wasn't a whole lot of talk about deciding which campus was going to be best. And of course, this is, decades before charter schools ever came into anybody's mindset. Your options were public school, or if you had a lot of money, maybe you went to the private, or, where I grew up, there were no private schools, but there was the diocese schools, so the Catholic schools, and those were your two options. And you couldn't go to the diocese school unless you were a tithe returning Catholic in that diocese, right? So that limited choice even more. Certainly as a parent, I was a little more thoughtful about where my kids went. I put my kids in a magnet school. There were no charters still when my kids were growing up. At least, I think my son might have been in high school before they had their first charter school in my community. So I put them in a magnet program, which, some districts still operate, although I think most of the funding is still gone for that. And then parents may be a little bit more mindful, magnet or charter. But those are parents that are thinking about choice. Again, this thought as to where do I put my child and what's best for them. I certainly don't want to, while we're talking about choice and options, I don't want people to think that all charter schools are all focused on college prep, high achievement. There are options, right?
Sure.
So can you give us a couple of those? Because I know a few, but I'm limited. Texas charter schools.
Yeah. Well, thank you for asking that, because we love to talk about it. So I can give you a few examples. One example is what we call in Texas alternative accountability or dropout recovery schools. So these are schools for, generally speaking, for students who were at a traditional high school, but for whatever reason, they didn't finish. And sometimes that's because they had personal circumstances that, just made it really hard. They had a child themselves, or they were supporting, they had to work to support a family member, or whatever it was. And in Texas, dropout recovery programs, they are disproportionately charter schools. So I think it's a much higher percentage, right, of those programs that are charters. And it sort of makes sense in that, part of the reason charter schools were created was to have flexibility and to be nimble. And you see that at these schools, right? You see they have different sorts of schedules where students can go to class part of the day and then part of the day not, or get, vocational training or some other kind of training if that's the route that they're going to go. So we see a lot of those. One really, really neat kind of charter school that we're seeing more of is a charter school that is specialized and dedicated to helping students with disabilities. So there are a few different, for example, autism-focused charter schools where that's what they do, right? Every educator has all the training, and there are very, very small classes. Every child has like a very carefully laid out behavior, plan. Like, what did they need, right, to thrive? And so we're seeing more of that, which I think is another great use of kind of the flexibility and the freedom that charters have.
And certainly, you're not going to choose to open an autism-focused school unless you are truly passionate about children with autism. I mean, that's not an easy, certainly not cherry picking. the best and brightest students, that is a very niche population that has some very, very specific requirements in order to foster their learning. So I think that that's pretty cool. And I don't know that I have ever, I say in my 45 states that I've worked in, all the public schools across America, I don't know that I've ever seen a regular K-12 public school district that has a school for children with autism.
Yeah, and it meets a need. I mean, these are
certainly
incredibly popular programs. And one thing I was just learning actually is that a lot of parents, they weren't in the public school system before they had that sort of option. They either just were doing the best they could homeschooling their child or working with their child at home, or they were going to like a specialized sort of clinic where, the clinicians are trained in working with those kids. But now they have this option inside the public school system.
Right.
So that makes a huge difference.
That is huge. Let's talk about African American student achievement in charter schools in Texas.
Yeah. I'm going to
pull your document up.
Yeah, you mentioned before we love data, and this is we did a project recently of kind of looking at the data that surrounds that. And it's really encouraging. I think there's a lot to be proud of in terms of the state assessments, right? Mm-hmm. Showing progress in that way. Kind of what I talked about before with advanced courses and having those sorts of opportunities. And then, of course, kind of readiness for the future, right? We're finding that charter schools are helping increase SAT scores, increase the percentage of students who meet the state's college, career, and military readiness standard, and just be poised for really successful futures. And that's exciting.
Yeah. So I'm looking at that flyer right now, and I'll call this out because I love numbers. That it says more Black students at Texas public charter schools take advanced classes that build high-level skills. So AP and IB course participation, which is what we were talking about, public schools for Black students is 35%. At charter schools, it's 54%. So we're talking about more than half of the Black students in charter schools are taking AP and IB, compared to about a third of them in the regular ISDs.
Yeah.
And that's huge. So that one is kind of in my lane because I've talked about this and I've written about, the Black children and racialized children or marginalized children having access, not just access, but excelling in AP and IB coursework. And one of the challenges to that is that either in the feeder schools to the high schools, so back to your neighborhood schools, where we typically see in marginalized populations that the achievement is lower, that those children don't have the tool skills to be successful in AP or IB, or they're feeding into high schools still in neighborhoods that are primarily of color, where the courses aren't offered. So sort of a double impact. If they have the opportunity to take the class, they may not have the tool skills for it because they came from an underachieving elementary feeder school, or they just don't have the options there. So I think that one's huge. Again, that's more than half. That's big. I'm curious now as to think about how does that look across the nation, just because I do have a national audience, but I'll ask listeners, what does that look like in your state? And send us a note or leave a comment. And you talked about the third point on here is that closing achievement gap. So the high school graduation rate for all students in the state of Texas is 93%, but for Black students in charter schools, it's 97%. That's kind of, so, of course, I'm going, so what is the high school graduation rate for Black students in Texas, regular publics, non-charters? That's my curiosity question. But it's not going to be 93%, I can tell you that much.
Yeah, I don't have that one hand. We can look that up though, for sure.
Yeah. Just curious. But like I said, if all students are 93% across all the ISDs, Black students are not 93% across the ISDs in Texas. I mean, I'm going to say a well-educated guess. I'm going to guess it's somewhere in the mid 80s. Maybe I'm wrong. Average SAT score is higher by 32 points. Higher college, career, and military readiness by 15 points, if I'm doing my mental math correct. And a higher rate by 7 to 12 points on credit for college prep courses. So literally across the board, I'll say it this way, Texas public charter schools are kicking tail with Black students. And I'm just going to venture a guess. I know that our largest racialized population in the state of Texas are Latino students, and I'm going to guess that the results there are similar.
They are, which we're working on kind of another data project with that in mind.
Okay.
The one thing I find really interesting, I think it's the one stat here that it's if you're looking at the handouts in a bright blue box, you didn't mention a second ago, is we look at how many students enroll in college. And that's not necessarily what every student wants to do, but we feel like it's important to equip students to be able to follow that path. And so at public charter schools, Black students who graduate, 59% of them, so almost 6 out of 10, go on and enroll in college. And statewide, it's 45%.
Wow.
You know, and one kind of exciting area, I think, that we're seeing some public charter schools kind of really lean into is actually supporting students once they're in college, right? And being a resource for them, whether that's just like navigating student life as somebody who is just starting college, which I think a lot of us can remember what that's like.
Yeah.
Or even how do I handle my financial situation? How do I, work with scholarships and all that?
Right.
So yeah, it's exciting. It's exciting.
I noticed another data point on here, I'll call it out only because I talk a lot about, I actually have these 4 equity indicators that I've written about, and I've got a podcast episode, I think it's back in the single digits or, the low teens in terms of episode number. But one of those is representation, and whether or not for students can see themselves in the materials that they use. Can they see themselves reflected in the educators and school leaders that surround them? And the national teaching force is roughly 85% white and overwhelmingly female. Our student enrollment nationwide is more than 60% students of color. And so almost no matter what state you're looking at, if you are Black or brown, you are not seeing educators who look like you, and very often not seeing yourself reflected in your textbooks. Textbooks are getting better. And I am proud to work with textbook companies that are making a concerted effort to change the way marginalized and racialized students are presented in the materials that they publish. So I know that there's a change there, but what we see already with Texas public charter schools, at least for Black kids, 23% of charter educators are Black. Compared to statewide, it's 12%. So, and having schools that are specialized very often, if you are focused on, just going to venture a guess, there are some bilingual academies out there focused on Spanish as the primary language, and that they're going to have a disproportionate number of students who want to maintain that heritage language, and so go to school for multilingual education being taught by native speakers of their language, right, that look like them. As I said, I'm at, with our school, Beatrice Mays Institute, we are historically Black school, and the vast majority of our students are Black, 93% Black, as are the vast majority of our educators, so our children and our leadership. So our children can see themselves in positions of higher education and leadership on a day-to-day basis. And I think that makes a big difference when we talk about the culture that is fostered in a school. Why charter schools may do better. You talked about that relationship that teachers can have with the parents, and that having that common culture is fostered that way as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It absolutely matters. And I think, too, just not only having educators who look like you if you're a student, but also school leaders, right? Yeah. Having superintendents and principals. That matters too. I think when we talk to students, it maybe even matters a little more than you might think.
Right. Yeah.
It's kind of the impression that I get.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's kind of cool. We can celebrate diversity in many different ways. And for us to recognize that for children, and as you said, it may be more important for the children than we even think, because as we get older, we have sort of taught ourselves out of the idea that I need to see someone who looks like me so that I can feel good about what I'm doing or that I'm comfortable talking to them. But these are still children who may not be able to voice that. But I think the data does a lot of that voicing for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also happening in conjunction with getting great results, right?
Right.
And that's something that I think is amazing. I mean, we're seeing that students are performing so well, academically. Their schools are helping them perform so well academically, and they're going on to have all these opportunities. And the obviously their teachers played a huge role in that.
Huge roles. Yeah. So I've got about 2 minutes before we start to wrap. Anything I didn't ask you want to tell us about, brag about, boast about, share?
Wow. Let's see. We've covered a lot of ground. I mean, I think one thing I did want to touch on just briefly is there can be a sense, I think, that the relationship between public charter schools and traditional districts, other public schools, has to be this sort of adversarial one, and I don't think that's the case. We certainly, there are a lot of families where one child goes to a charter school and one child goes to their traditional district public school.
Right.
And we're really, we're of course excited about the way that public charter schools are moving the ball forward. But this is part of, I think this is important, this is part of a bigger project, right? It's helping to make sure that every child has a great public school, and the one that works for them. So we're, I would interpret all of this data through that sort of point of view.
Yeah. We can meet the needs of every child. That's this thing called equity.
Yeah. Exactly.
That we don't always want to call out that equity and diversity thing. In some places, those are bad words, but that's really what it is. It's meeting the needs of every child without harming anybody else. So I have one more question for you. And that's one that I pose to everyone who joins me on the show. When I sign off on the show, I paraphrase Dr. Angela Davis, who said, I am no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I am changing the things I cannot accept. So I always ask every guest, what is one thing that you cannot accept? And then is there anything that listeners can do to help support changing that?
Wow. I think it comes back, it just again comes back to having enough opportunities in education. And it's still, even after all the progress we've made, it still can come down to where you live. And I think it's important for people, if they don't have, especially, families, parents, it's important that if you don't have an option where you are confident your child is going to thrive, that you don't just accept that, right? And we can push for that. We can push for that. And that's something that our association does is, we're always trying to educate everybody, but educate lawmakers too. And I think, that's one of the issues where it really matters whether you've introduced yourself to your state representative or your state senator and made your educational needs known. I think that carries a lot of weight. It carries maybe more weight than people think.
Yeah. We are better lobbyists for our children than paid lobbyists are. Maybe I'll say it that way, that as parents, we should be our children's greatest advocates. Ladies and gentlemen, my guest today has been Brian Whitley of the Texas Public Charter Schools Association. His contact info, did I say Charter Schools Association? Charter Schools Association. His contact info will be down in the notes, along with how you can follow TPCSA on social. And I'm going to try and get this one flyer that we have on Black Achievement in Texas Charter Schools added down there. So look for that as well. Brian, I want to thank you for joining me. It's always enlightening. And for me, I always love the opportunity to learn more about organizations that are working with our children. So thank you for joining me. And then Equity Warriors. As Brian just told you, get involved. If you don't have options where you live, start talking, contact TPCSA and let them help be your guide to getting choice where you live. And don't forget to vote. I always say like your life depended on it. It's election season, so make sure you are registered to vote. I know in Texas, the last day to register to vote is like next week, this week, sometime soon. So make sure you're registered and that you vote for your school board, your mayor, your city council, all those local and state representatives. Advocate for education through social media. Make sure you're following me across channels, like, share, subscribe, and join me again next week. Don't forget, big news coming up. Send your questions, topics, and requests to info@askdrberry.com. And as always, don't worry about the things you cannot change. Change the things you can no longer accept. And I'll see you next week.
That's it for today's episode of the 3E Podcast. Head over to iTunes and subscribe to the show. One lucky listener every single week that posts a review on iTunes will win a chance in a grand prize drawing to win a $25,000 value private VIP day with Dr. Berry herself. Be sure to head over to 3epodcast.com and pick up a free copy of Dr. Berry's gift. Then join us on the next episode.